In the bustling heart of Osaka, where neon lights bathed the streets in a colorful glow, Shinrei Tower loomed over the city like a forgotten shadow. Its dark, towering presence seemed to suck the life from the surrounding blocks, where even the busiest crowds passed in silence. The building had been abandoned by most, left with only rumors and whispers as reminders of its past. The few who dared to speak of it did so in hushed tones, sharing stories that made even the bravest shiver. That night, Takeshi, a young elevator technician, sat across from his manager in their small, dimly lit office. He'd been called in for an unexpected meeting, and the tension in the room was thick. His boss, an older man with graying hair and a weary expression, was drumming his fingers on the desk in a nervous rhythm. Between them sat a tall stack of paperwork, but Takeshi's attention wasn't on that. It was on the strange, almost fearful look on his manager's face. "You're sure about this, Takeshi?" his boss asked, voice barely above a whisper. He glanced down at a piece of paper in his hands, crumpled and creased as if it had been read and reread by many before him. "This isn't just another job. Shinrei Tower. It's different." Takeshi chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, boss. It's just another building, right? Maybe some flickering lights or creaky floors? I've dealt with worse in these old buildings around town." But his manager wasn't convinced. He placed the crumpled paper on the desk, sliding it over to Takeshi. "Read this," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Remember these rules, and don't ignore them no matter what." Confused, Takeshi picked up the note. The paper felt oddly heavy in his hand, as though it carried a weight far greater than its physical form. He read the list. "Do not take the elevator to the 4th floor after midnight. If you see a child inside, do not make eye contact. If anyone calls from the 12th floor, do not respond. If the elevator stops at the 13th floor, pray." The rules were simple, but the warnings left a strange chill in his chest. Takeshi forced a laugh, waving the paper like it was a joke. "Ghost stories, huh? I didn't peg you as the superstitious type, boss." But his boss's face remained serious, his eyes hollow and weary. "It's no joke, Takeshi. These rules were left by the last technician to work there, and he was never the same after his last shift. Just promise me you'll take them seriously." Later that night, Takeshi arrived at Shinrei Tower. He had dismissed the conversation as he left the office, brushing it off as just another quirk of his boss's personality. Yet, as he stood outside the towering building, looking up at its endless rows of darkened windows, a sense of dread settled over him. The rain drizzled down his jacket as he hesitated at the entrance, feeling the weight of the building pressing down on him even from outside. He was the only one around, the streets eerily silent as he stepped through the door. Inside, the lobby was dim, bathed in a faint greenish glow from flickering fluorescent lights. Shadows clung to the corners, and every sound echoed in the empty space, amplifying even the slightest shuffle of his feet. The building manager, an older man with a face marked by deep lines of age and worry, appeared from behind the reception desk. He watched Takeshi approach, his gaze a mixture of relief and something else. "Fear? So, you're the technician for tonight," he muttered, his voice low and uneasy. He looked around as though expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "Just remember, follow the rules." Takeshi nodded, brushing off the man's warning with a polite smile. Rules or no rules, he wasn't about to let some urban legends get to him. It was an old building, and he had a job to do. Yet, as he turned to the elevator, he felt a prickling unease settle on his skin. Something about the manager's expression made him pause, but he shook it off and stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the 8th floor. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and the familiar hum of the machinery filled the silence. Takeshi took a deep breath, letting the steady rhythm calm his nerves. He leaned against the wall, letting his mind drift as the elevator rose. But just as he began to relax, the elevator slowed, then stopped. He looked up, confused. The digital display blinked, indicating he was on the 4th floor. He hadn't pressed this button. The doors opened with a metallic groan, revealing a long, dimly lit hallway stretching into the shadows. Takeshi felt a chill creep up his spine as he remembered the first rule. Do not take the elevator to the 4th floor after midnight. The hallway was silent, but in the flickering light, he could see a figure standing at the far end. A small figure, a child. She stood with her back to him, her tiny frame outlined by the flickering lights. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her back, and her hands hung limply at her sides. She didn't move, didn't turn. She simply stood there, frozen in place. Takeshi's pulse quickened as he recalled the second rule. If you see a child inside, do not make eye contact. He gripped the edges of the elevator, his knuckles white as he fought the urge to call out. Part of him wanted to ask if she needed help, but something deeper, some primal instinct, kept him silent. Instead, he closed his eyes tightly, his hands shaking as he forced himself not to look. The silence pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, the doors finally slid shut, and the elevator continued its ascent. Takeshi let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he opened his eyes. Just nerves, he muttered to himself, trying to laugh, though it came out more as a nervous chuckle. Too many horror movies. But no matter how much he tried to shake it off, a sense of dread lingered, gnawing at him like an unwelcome memory. The rules. Maybe they weren't just stories. The elevator reached the 12th floor, and the doors slid open once more. This time, a faint, desperate voice drifted through the darkness, freezing him in place. Help! The voice was soft, raspy, as though from someone who hadn't spoken in ages. Help me, please. His heart pounded as he remembered the third rule. If someone calls from the 12th floor, do not respond. He clenched his hands, staring straight ahead, willing himself not to react. But the voice grew louder, more insistent, taking on a pleading, almost panicked tone. Please don't leave me here. Help me. Takeshi squeezed his eyes shut, every instinct screaming at him to look, to help. But the rules echoed in his mind, his boss's solemn face flashing in his memory. He held his breath, standing rigid and unmoving until the doors finally closed. The elevator ascended, but Takeshi's heart continued to pound, his mind racing with questions. He forced himself to focus, determined to finish the job and leave. But as the elevator climbed, it slowed again, stopping unexpectedly on the 13th floor. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as he remembered the last rule. If the elevator stops at the 13th floor, pray. The doors opened slowly, revealing a pitch-black hallway. Takeshi's breath hitched as a cold draft blew into the elevator, chilling him to the bone. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and shifting in unnatural shapes. He couldn't see anything, but he felt something watching him, lurking just beyond the darkness. With every ounce of willpower, he reached for the button panel, his hands shaking as he pressed the close door button repeatedly. The elevator doors moved painfully slowly, as though fighting against some unseen force. His pulse hammered in his ears as he kept pressing the button, whispering silent prayers under his breath. Finally, the doors shut, and the elevator resumed its climb. Takeshi let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his body trembling with relief and fear. When the elevator reached the top floor, he stepped out, his legs weak beneath him. He didn't look back as he hurried to finish his work, his mind numb with exhaustion. As he left the building that night, Takeshi glanced back at Shinrei Tower, its dark windows staring back at him like empty, soulless eyes. The rules weren't just stories, and the secrets of Shinrei Tower were ones he wished he'd never known. Takeshi was exhausted, his hands calloused and sore after hours of work in Shinrei Tower. The call had come just past midnight, an elevator malfunction on one of the upper floors. Though reluctant, he had agreed to take the shift an easy paycheck for what was supposed to be a quick fix. Little did he know it would become one of the most terrifying nights of his life. As he rode up in the elevator, he couldn't shake a sense of unease. Shinrei Tower had a reputation among the maintenance staff, though they rarely talked about it openly. Stories circulated about strange occurrences, lights flickering, odd shadows in empty corridors, and whispers late at night. Takeshi brushed these tales aside as superstitions or harmless pranks. Yet tonight, he felt that unsettling energy himself. The elevator car whirred and clanked as it ascended, the sound echoing in the silence of the nearly empty building. Just as he was reaching for his toolkit, he heard a voice, soft but clear, whispering just outside the elevator doors. Takeshi's heart leapt. He stared at the metal doors, wondering if he had imagined it. Then the voice came again, faint but unmistakable, a raspy whisper, something about the rules. Takeshi squeezed his eyes shut, beads of sweat trickling down his temples. He wanted to press the intercom button to call for help or radio his coworkers, but he forced himself to stay still, afraid to make a sound, afraid to respond. Moments passed, and slowly, the elevator doors creaked shut, sealing him away from the haunting whispers. But that feeling of dread remained. The elevator resumed its climb, and Takeshi let out a shallow breath. Just as he began to relax, he noticed the light above him flickering, casting erratic shadows against the walls. He frowned and looked up. The digital floor display blinked, numbers scrambling in a confusing glitch, then stopped. The number that appeared made his heart skip a beat. 13. Takeshi's breath hitched. He knew there was no 13th floor in Shinrei Tower. It had been intentionally omitted when the building was constructed. And yet, here he was, feeling the elevator's movement slow as it reached an unknown floor. The elevator lurched to a halt, and the doors slid open with an eerie, metallic groan. Before him stretched a dark, unfamiliar hallway, one that seemed to lead nowhere but deeper into shadows. Cold, stale air drifted into the elevator, carrying with it a scent that made him recoil. The smell was thick, heavy, like something long dead and rotting in a forgotten place. He took out his flashlight, his hands trembling. The thin beam cut through the darkness, illuminating smears of a dark, oily substance on the walls. He squinted, his stomach churning at the sight. It looked almost like blood. He shivered and forced himself to look away. As he stepped forward, the elevator doors closed behind him with a final hollow clang, trapping him on this mysterious floor. He hesitated, wanting to turn back, but some invisible force seemed to pull him forward, deeper into the darkness. The hallway was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. Shadows pulsed and shifted along the walls, creating the eerie illusion of movement, though Takeshi was alone. He took another step, his heartbeat pounding in his ears, his flashlight trembling in his grip. Then, at the end of the corridor, he saw her, a figure, ghostly pale, standing with her back to him. She wore a torn white dress that seemed to blend into the shadows, her movements slow and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Takeshi felt his breath catch, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. but he was frozen in place, eyes locked on the figure. The woman tilted her head, a twitchy, jerking movement that sent chills down his spine. She was motionless for a moment, then began to turn. Takeshi's flashlight wavered as her face came into view. Dark hair fell over her eyes, leaving only her mouth visible, stretched into a grotesque grin that seemed too wide, too unnatural. It was a smile that didn't belong on any human face. "You broke the rules," she whispered, her voice raspy and hollow, like nails scraping against metal. The sound crawled under his skin, making him shudder. Takeshi stumbled back, his mind racing. What rules? He hadn't done anything wrong, had he? Heart pounding, he fumbled for the elevator button, pressing it repeatedly, desperate to escape. But the woman began to move toward him, her limbs jerking at odd angles, as though held by invisible strings. Her hands stretched out, reaching for him, her joints cracking with each step. "Please, no," Takeshi whispered, his voice barely audible. "Close. Please, close." Finally, mercifully, the elevator doors slid shut, just as the woman was inches from him. Takeshi gasped, slumping against the wall. He could still feel her presence, like a cold imprint left on his skin. The elevator began its descent, but just as he thought he was safe, the lights flickered again, plunging him into darkness. His breath caught, and he listened intently. For a few moments, there was silence. Then it started a faint sound, like distant laughter. Takeshi strained to listen, hoping he was imagining things. But the laughter grew louder, filling the elevator. It was the laughter of children, playful and innocent, yet twisted with a sinister undertone that made Takeshi's blood run cold. He covered his ears, trying to block out the sound. "Stop! Please, stop!" he whispered, feeling trapped, helpless. But the laughter only grew louder, mocking him, filling the small elevator until it was all he could hear. The walls seemed to close in, the noise drowning out his own ragged breathing. With a sudden jolt, the elevator came to a stop. The lights flickered back on, and the doors opened to reveal the lobby. Takeshi stumbled out, barely able to stand, his face pale and his clothes drenched in cold sweat. He looked around, his eyes wild with fear. The building manager was standing nearby, watching him with an unreadable expression. There was no shock, no sympathy in his eyes, only a detached calm, as though he'd seen this all before. "You broke the rules," the manager said quietly. His tone was flat, matter of fact. Takeshi tried to speak, his voice shaking. I don't understand. There was a woman, and the voices." The manager raised a hand, stopping him. "You'll be back," he said, his eyes unfeeling. "They always come back." Without another word, Takeshi turned and bolted out of Shinrei Tower. He ran through the rain-soaked streets, not stopping until he was far from the building's looming shadow. He looked back once, and for a moment, it felt as if the dark windows of Shinrei Tower were watching him, as if the building itself had eyes. Days passed, and word spread among the maintenance crew that Takeshi had quit. Rumors flew. Some said he'd seen something that drove him to the edge. Others said he'd just snapped from the stress. No one knew the full story, but everyone noticed the lingering fear in his eyes whenever he mentioned Shinrei Tower. After Takeshi's haunting experience, the Shinrei Tower maintenance crew stayed uneasy. With Takeshi no longer willing to return, the building needed another technician. A new one was assigned, someone who hadn't heard the full story, and who hadn't seen the look of terror in Takeshi's eyes. But from the moment the new technician arrived, strange things continued to happen. The other staff members whispered among themselves about eerie occurrences. Lights in the hallways would flicker erratically, even though no electrical problems were ever found. Sometimes, a lone corridor light would blink out completely, plunging sections of the building into darkness for a few unsettling moments before slowly coming back to life. And there were the noises: metal creaking, soft tapping sounds from within the walls, and low hums echoing through empty spaces. These sounds always seemed louder when the building was at its quietest, in the dead of night. Yet, the most disturbing of all was the laughter. On some nights, faint laughter, high-pitched and distant, echoed from within the elevator shaft. It sounded like children giggling, playful yet chilling in its unnatural tone. The elevator was often empty when this happened, but employees passing by late at night swore they could hear it. The sound would drift through the lobby, filling the vast, empty space and mingling with the hum of the machinery. Passersby reported hearing whispers, soft, urgent murmurings that seemed to come from behind the walls or beneath the floors. Some described it as the sound of someone pleading, a voice that was barely a whisper, calling out for help as if trapped far below the surface. The voice would fade if anyone tried to get closer, slipping away before anyone could fully understand the words or locate their source. Despite these stories, Shinrei Tower remained a steadfast, unmovable part of the city skyline. By day, its sleek architecture and modern glass panels shone under the sunlight, a deceptive facade hiding the darkness within. But at night, the tower transformed, casting ominous shadows over the streets. On stormy nights, when rain battered against its high windows and lightning flashed, it looked less like a modern office tower and more like a brooding entity, something alive, lurking in plain sight. Locals swore that, on these rainy nights, an unnatural stillness seemed to fall over the tower, as though it was watching, waiting. Those passing by in the small hours of the night felt a strange compulsion to look away from its looming silhouette. The air around Shinrei Tower felt dense, charged with an energy that seemed almost alive, as if the building itself harbored secrets it would protect at any cost. Shinrei Tower was hungry, they'd say. Hungry for the next soul to enter its doors, break its silent rules, and become part of the ever-growing mystery within.